We're having a Halloween party at school. I'm dressed up like Dracula. Man, I look cool. I dyed my hair black and I cut off my bangs. I'm wearing a cape and some fake plastic fangs. I put on some makeup to paint my face white, like creatures that only come out in the night. My fingernails, too, are all pointed and red. I look like I'm recently back from the dead. My mum drops me off and I run into school and suddenly feel like the world's biggest fool. The other kids stare like I'm some kind of freak. The Halloween party is not till next week. Hello, 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 and welcome to this Halloween-themed edition of the Jolly Heretic. Now, it's an interesting phenomenon, Halloween. It's something which has become more and more popular of late, more and more popular in recent years. I came to Finland 15 years ago, and there was no Halloween in Finland 15 years ago. It wasn't celebrated at all. There was Halloween in England when I was a child, although there wasn't Halloween when my parents were children. We've become more and more interested in this Halloween idea. Now, one interpretation of Halloween is it's part of what Douglas Davis of Derby University calls words against death. The idea is that it's a response to our own mortality, our response to our fear of death and our fear of things that we associate with the dark side of death, like ghouls and demons and devils and ghosts and things like this, our fear of all of these things that are unpleasant that's associated with death. And so we kind of confront these things, we take control of them by acting them out ourselves, rather like how people tattoo themselves with images of death. It's a way of taking control of death, a feeling that you're in control of it, and therefore we go through these rituals, in particular at times of change, because times of change make us doubt ourselves, they doubt the structure, make us doubt the structure of reality, they make us think about things like death, and so at times like that we do things to restructure our lives, either by coming together as groups and engaging in rituals, and in particular on the eve of All Hallows, the idea that there's this deathly time, we're passing on an old pagan ritual. That's the one idea, but on the other hand, we're also confronting death. Words against death. In fact, there's an extremely popular idea in general that that's what religion is. Religion is a response to death. It's a reaction to death. And indeed, there are studies that have shown that when we have our mortality salience elevated, when we are primed with ideas of death, then we do tend to become more religious, and that we tend to become more religious in times in which we are confronted with death, such as in the wake of war or in the wake of plague. Now, as a consequence of this, you do have this very strong idea that religion is about death. Religion is, in a way, the kind of denial of death. And there was a very interesting book that was written in 1973, and the author, Ernest Becker, actually died in 1974 and was posthumously awarded the Pulitzer Prize for Literature for this book called The Denial of Death. And what he basically does is he takes this idea that what religion is, or what the central aspect of life is, our own mortality, and he runs with it. And basically his idea is that religion is a way of dealing with life, of dealing with a response to death, with the fear of death and being confronted with their own mortality, and that's it. Now, I think this is a very interesting book in sense that it has a great deal of cultural influence. It's been cited in Woody Allen films. It was cited by Bill Clinton. It's a massively successful book. But like a lot of massively successful books, it's massively successful because it's simplistic, because it gives people a message they want to hear, and it fits in with the general zeitgeist. And so I want to look at this book today. I was commissioned to do this video by our squire, by the way, at the Jolly Heretic, and I want to look at this book today, look at what it says, and look at why I have very serious problems with it. Now, basically, what he argues, this chap, Ernest Becker, in The Denial of Death, is that civilization itself, really, can be understood to be a product of a kind of defense mechanism against our knowledge of mortality. We become sufficiently intelligent, this is good. I mean, he doesn't actually look at intelligence, but we become sufficiently intelligent that we can structure the world and think about things and all this kind of thing. This is a good thing, but this means that we end up with self-awareness, with awareness of death, and with therefore knowledge of our own mortality. This is hammered home to us all the time because we are confronted with our physical aging bodies. And in fact, we are confronted with the animal dimension of ourselves. One of the things that Becker looks at in detail is the fact that humans go to the loo, and the fact that this is kind of disgusting and revolting, and shows us that we're far from perfect, we're far from immortal, we're far from whatever. We're just animals. We've come from dust, and unto dust
we will return. And so these kinds of processes make us constantly aware of the sceptre of death, of the fact that we're going to die. He argues that we deal with this in general by creating what he calls an immortality project of heroism, which, as far as I can work out, is basically some sort of metaphor for religion. So we have an immortality project, a worldview, a way of seeing the world in which our lives are of eternal importance. In fact, our lives are eternal and we will not ultimately die. Our lives have this meaning. We are a kind of hero in our lives, in a world in which there is eternity, in which there is gods and whatever. We have eternal significance. We are, in a sense, heroes in the view of these gods, and one day we will return to these gods. So consequently, we have overcome our fear of death, our anxiety of death, by denying death, but by doing so in a very specific way, that is to say, in a way whereby we become a hero in our own sort of morality tale that is our life, and our life has eternal significance. By repressing our fear of death, and by creating this idea that our life has eternal importance and we need to serve these gods and so on, and doing what these gods tell us to, as far as I can work out, he said, we therefore end up developing civilization itself, because what civilization is founded on is this idea that we develop and we grow and we do things of eternal importance for the kind of glory of our hero project. We each of us participate in life in this heroic way in order to do our very best as part of our project of eternally imbued heroism, and this is where civilization develops from. Now, the next point that he makes is that this leads to religious conflict, because when you have one hero project which says that there are certain truths and these are eternally important or whatever, and it's confronted with another hero project which sees other things as eternally important, then that makes one doubt one's own hero project. That makes one doubt one's own the thing which is stopping one from being confronted with one's own mortality and one's own death, and so therefore one fights against that and tries to destroy the person who has a different hero project, a different religion or a different ideology, that sort of thing. So that's why we don't like people that apparently, according to Becker, that have different worldviews and different religions from ourselves. He adds that not everybody participates to the same extent in this hero project. Some people deny death by tranquilizing themselves against it using drugs and using drink and using other sort of superficial methods like that. He argues that in a world in which we have ever more reason and logic, we start to doubt our hero projects because we reason that they are a problem, and therefore we become depressed and unhappy. And he argues that depression is a result of either failing to live up to your own expectations of what a hero is like in your own hero project, doubting the veracity of your hero project. Schizophrenia, he argues, is a way of dealing with the denial of death, with the sceptre of death, whereby you create your own world, and which is a world of fantasy, and you deny all other worlds. And so that's it. So that's basically the essence of this book. Now, I have to say, I don't think it's very good. And Jordan Peterson has argued that it is a very good book, he says, but that it is fundamentally also, it's seriously flawed and wrong. I'd go much further than that. I think it's just the usual example of this kind of pop psychology nonsense, which infests discussions of these things. There are numerous flaws in it, and I want to look at those flaws now. Now, the first flaw is obviously that it assumes that everything is a matter of environment, that there is no genetic dimension. It assumes a blank slate whereby we are all individuals confronted with our own mortality, and that we react to that through religion and what he calls the hero project or the ideology. Now, this raises, of course, many questions. Why is it that some people don't react to it in a religious way? Why is it that some people react to it in a more religious way than other people? Why is it that some people, even during this period of reason which makes us doubt our hero project, why is it that they still react in a religious way to being confronted with death? Why is it that some people are more fascinated and morbid and interested in death than others? Why is it that, and so on. It begs all of these questions because it fails to appreciate the genetic dimension. The heritability of how religious you are, based on twin studies, has been found to be at least 0.4. The heritability of fundamentalism, religion or of having a religious experience, a conversion experience, which tends to mean that you're very, very strongly religious, has been found to be more in the region of 0.7. Nihilism, atheism, these kinds of opposite ways of seeing the world have been found to be highly heritable. Depression, and therefore a tendency to regard life as pointless, to regard life as futile, to regard yourself as not being a hero, to not believe in God, and see life as having no eternal significance. That itself has been shown to be highly genetic. So this genetic dimension is completely ignored by this. It is assumed that religion sort of comes about every generation in response to everybody realizing that there's death. Now, this is of course not the case. Religion is an adaptation. Consistent with that, religiousness is found in all cultures. Religiousness is partly genetic. There are specific parts of the brain, such as the anterior frontal cortex, which have been found to be associated with religiousness. And if these are stimulated with magnets, you become both more religious and more ethnocentric. Religiousness is associated with health, physical health. Religiousness is associated with mental health. Religiousness is associated with fertility. Religiousness is associated with being with things that would be selected for, such as being highly pro-social, being low in mental instability, and all this sort of thing. So the idea that it's just a matter of environment, and that every generation we each confront the mysterium tremendum et fascinans, the response to death, and that's how religion comes about, is palpably untrue. Now, the second thing that he assumes is that religiousness is only a response to death, is that this hero project comes about as a response to death. But there are other means via which it could easily come about, and indeed evidently has done. One of these is a response to being a pro-social creature. So one of the things that's been found is that religiousness is associated with being high in the personality trait agreeableness, that is to say altruism and empathy, high in the personality trait conscientiousness, that is to say rule following, and this is and high basically in pro-social traits, and high in social anxiety but low in other traits of mental instability. Now this implies that religiousness is partly a matter of functioning in a social group. If you believe that there is a homunculus on your shoulder all the time wanting you to behave in a pro-social way, God is there wanting you to be pro-social, then you will be less likely to be cast out by the band, less likely to be killed, more likely to be treated nicely, more likely to gain lots of friends and people that will look after you, more likely to be rescued by other people, more likely to be looked after, more likely to pass on your genes in the Darwinian struggle. And so you can see how religiousness will come about for that reason. Second point is that people that are high in empathy tend to strongly believe in God, and people that are low in empathy tend not to believe in God. People that are autistic and lack empathy tend not to believe in God. And when they've done analyses of the brains of people who are praying, it is the social parts of the brain that are associated with talking to other people that seem to light up. So what seems to be going on is that in religiousness you are over-detecting your agency. You are fascinated, you're high in empathy. You're fascinated by looking for signals, external signals of internal states, looking for external signals of emotions. You're very good at doing that, to the extent that you transfer that over to the world itself, and you perceive evidence in the world itself of a mind behind the world. And people who are autistic, that just look at the world in a mechanical way, they don't do that. So part of how religiousness could have come about is via empathy. So it's not simply a response to death, it's also a response to living in a highly pro-social group. This is completely ignored in this person's analysis. Another analysis has found that we become more religious if we feel excluded. If people that feel that they are excluded become more religious. So if you're, again, so this is perhaps something that makes you want to be more pro-social, or want to act in a more pro-social way, or possibly that people will tend to like people that are religious, because if they're religious, then that implies that they believe that there's this moral God telling them how to behave and telling them to be pro-social, and so therefore if they signal that they are religious, they will in fact signal that they are trustworthy and pro-social, and therefore they won't be excluded anymore. So that would explain that. So again, it's not simply a response to death. Another issue that has to be taken into account is that Becker's analysis implies that you are confronted with death and therefore you become religious. But that's not the case with a lot of these people that are extremely religious. They never doubt it. They never doubt that God exists. They genuinely never doubt it. It's simply a matter of how fervently and how strongly they believe in God. But it doesn't occur to them to doubt that God exists. So there's not some moment of fear where they're confronted with their own mortality and the futility of their own lives. These things simply never cross their minds, because some people have been selected and for highly genetic are religious for highly genetic reasons. It's nothing to do with environment. It is true that studies by Norin, Zion and Sharif have shown that when confronted with mortality salience, we do become more religious. But it is a simplification. There are other factors involved. It also begs the question, it assumes that we stop being religious because of reason, so that there's some kind of idea that we become higher in reasoning capacity somehow, and therefore we doubt religion. But this begs other questions. I mean, this begs the question of why it is that there are some people, even in our time of reason, that still believe strongly in religiosity. It also begs the question of why it is that being in a time where there's lots of reason would necessarily make us doubt the veracity of religion, when you do get some people that seem to believe in reason and logic but also seem to be religious. So doesn't this imply that there is a certain kind of person with a certain kind of personality or a certain kind of intelligence who is more likely to doubt religion? And doesn't therefore this imply that this is not all a matter of environment and it's not all a matter of death? Another thing which he ignores is the way that religiousness has developed as a consequence of group selection. This is totally ignored. Now, I've looked at another video of this, that you could pass on your genes directly through having sex and having children at the kin level by looking after your extended kinship group, your nephews and nieces and whatever, who are 25% genetically the same as you, and further levels of genetic distance. And it has been shown that ethnic groups are genetic clusters. Two Frenchmen, random Frenchmen, are more similar to each other than a Frenchman and an Englishman. And therefore, particularly in times of intergroup conflict, there is good reason to cooperate and to operate at the level of the group. That's where warfare comes from. And it's been shown that even with very primitive groups, you do get group selection. You do get one ethnic group massacring, entirely killing the other ethnic group, which will promote whatever traits it is that the winning group has. So there is group selection, and despite what skeptics of it who don't like the idea that there is group selection may say, group selection is very, very real and exists. Now, what we find with group selection is that groups which are high in positive ethnocentrism, that is to say internal cooperation, and negative ethnocentrism, that is to say destroying the outsider and seeing the outsider as bad, those groups tend to dominate in the battle of group selection, according to computer models that have been done on this. It has been shown that religiousness promotes ethnocentrism, and indeed the parts of the brain that are associated with religiousness are also associated with ethnocentrism, and that is because the groups that survived under pre-modern conditions took things that were adaptive, such as ethnocentrism, and made them the will of God, such that they were more likely to be followed, because if the person who you're attacking, it's God's will that you kill them, and if it's God's will that you internally cooperate, then you're more likely to do so. Also, they come together because religiousness is adaptive, as we've already seen. Group level ethnocentrism is adaptive, and so the two things end up sort of merging together. Now, this would have then, in itself, further selected for religiousness, further ensured that only the most religious groups inherited the earth. And therefore, again, it would mean that religiousness was highly genetic, highly inbuilt, not simply a response to death at all, but more a response to genes and a response to our genetic inclinations. Now, it is true that with the Industrial Revolution, of course, we go from 50% child mortality in 1800 to 1% child mortality today. The brain is 84% of the genome, and consequently there's going to be a huge change from the nature of the people, the 10% of the current population which was alive then, who were all strongly selected for religiousness and were highly religious, and what we are like now. So what we are like now, the other 90% of us, would be deviations from that. So if we were genetically selected to collectively worship a moral God and very strongly believe in God, now this is going to be less the case. And it's going to be less the case in a context of very low mortality salience, with mortality salience elevating religiousness, so we're going to therefore become much less religious. And so it's going to seem to us like religiousness is a response to death. And for a lot of people, it will be that they only become religious at times of death, at times of mortality salience. A lot of people watching this will very rarely pray, and if they do pray, they will do so when they're concerned that their father might die, or when they're concerned that their grandfather might die, or whatever it happens to be. So it may seem to us like religiousness is a response to death, because it only really hits in our lives at very occasional periods where we are confronted with death, and for the rest of the time we're not confronted with death, and therefore we can just not think about it, put it to the back of our minds, and if it ever comes up because we're feeling depressed or down or whatever, then we can deal with it by having a laugh or having a drink or taking some drugs or doing all kinds of other things which tranquilize, to use the terminology, which tranquilize us against death, by watching television, by immersing ourselves in comedy, by reading a good book, we don't have to think about it, it's not there. And very occasionally it comes into our it comes into our consciousness, as is now happening with the coronavirus, the corona pandemic. There was a period earlier this year where it was very much in our consciousness. We thought that the corona could get very, very bad. It was in our consciousness. There was this massive change in how we lived our lives, and the result of that seems to have been, as you would predict, with elevated mortality salience, so a kind of religious revival in some ways, in which you with BLM. There's a strong religious dimension to that. It took certain religious ideas from Christianity about guilt and shame and whatever, and kind of made them into something which has a sort of religious fervour to it, in many ways kind of rather like religion dogma and certainty and structure and order, but without God. Or you have QAnon, which also seems to be this sort of religious sort of pseudo-Christian sort of idea, whereby we are in a world that is run by evil, by the devil, basically, in sort of human manifestation, and that there is a figure who is going to smite him and deal with it, and then a sort of a better world will be created. These are the kind of responses you would expect, but for most of us, I think this rehashing of Freud, which is what a lot of this, or of Otto, or this book happens to be, it doesn't really work, and it becomes popular because it gives you a simplistic kind of idea, which is that religion is a response to death, words against death, whatever, that's what it is, and it completely removes any kind of genetic dimension, and people often don't like to think about the genetic dimension. But we should think about the genetic dimension because it is a very significant dimension to why there are differences in religiousness between us, and in why we respond to, when mortality salience comes in, why we respond to it in slightly different ways. There would be some people, and again, this is something Becker could have looked at but doesn't, who could be constitutionally incapable of being religious, no matter what the circumstances. It's like the genetics of religion for them is so low, it's just not possible. They can't become religious. It doesn't hit in. And there are other people that are religious all the time, no matter how stressed they are. They just become more religious the more stressed they are, but they're religious all the time. It's their default method. And it's the genetics of religion which is important here. And this is what is completely ignored in the denial of death. But so as you are celebrating Halloween, if you indeed celebrate Halloween, then okay, there may be a degree to which this is words against death, but it may even be true that the extent to which Halloween is found fascinating could itself have genetic dimensions. All right, now, I hope you have enjoyed this little review of this book by Ernest Becker, by The Denial of Death. And if you have, then feel free to support the channel, and there are ways you can do that. You can see in the box below. I live stream on Mondays and Thursdays at 7 p.m. UK time. And I will see you soon, and have a pleasant haunting, and goodbye!